It is my great privilege to turn the podium over to my Jones Day partner, Maureen Bennett, for the next panel on the important issue of hate directed at the LGBTQ community. Maureen.
Thank you very much, Laura, and good morning, everyone. It's such a privilege to be part of this important set of conversations across the conference. My name is Maureen Bennett. I'm a partner in the Boston office of Jones Day. I also serve as the co-chair of our LGBTQ plus affinity group, and I'm also proud to be a board member of Lambda Legal. And it's really my privilege to be in conversation with the panelists to my left. I will briefly introduce them, and then we'll dive into our conversation. First, right to my immediate left, Densil Porteous. He is the executive director and CEO of Stonewall Columbus. He has a long and distinguished history in working with nonprofits in the community, including as a board member for the Human Rights Campaign, as well as for Advocates for Youth, and also part of the Pride Fund. To my left again is Sarah Moore. She's the anti-LGBTQ plus extremism analyst for the Anti-Defamation League and GLAAD, and that is an organization, of course, focused on countering such extremism and hate. And then finally, last but not least, Roman Samotný. He joins us all the way from Slovakia. He is the director of Queer Slovakia and involved in a number of important initiatives, including one most aptly named Our Lives Are at Stake. And he himself was also the victim of an extremism attack, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. We'll also be joined at the end of the presentation by some remarks that have been sent forward to us from Jessica Stern, the Special Envoy to the Department of State for LGBTQI persons, and we'll talk about that a little bit further. But just to launch in, Sarah, maybe I'll start with you. Your colleague, Oren Siegel, provided some overview statistics earlier this morning about what we're seeing in terms of LGBTQ attacks, and the organization you work with published a major report earlier this year. I wonder if you could just give us a flavor of some of the key findings and trends that you're seeing from that report.
Sure, thanks so much, Maureen. So as Maureen mentioned, we published a report in June of this year. It was looking at anti-LGBTQ plus incidents from June of 2022 to April of 2023. In this report, we found that there were over 350 anti-LGBTQ plus incidents across the US. Of those, we broke that down into looking at harassment, vandalism, and assault, finding over 300 cases of harassment, 40 cases of vandalism, and 11 cases of assault. We were also able to kind of break that down in terms of the persons and places that were targeted by some of these perpetrators. And what we found is that drag performers and the events that drag performers were going to perform at were one of the most frequent targets of this type of violence and hate. And we also found that schools, healthcare facilities and providers, and government buildings and officials were some of the most targeted entities for anti-LGBTQ plus incidents in the US.
Right. And did you see any threads in terms of root causes? Did the report talk about that at all, Sarah?
Yes, so one of the things that we tracked in this report was anti-LGBTQ plus narratives, or some of the stories and rhetoric that is spreading online around anti-LGBTQ plus hate. So one of the more popular ones that you're probably familiar with is this conversation around grooming, or these claims that falsely state that LGBTQ plus adults are somehow sexual predators or trying to groom young kids. And we actually tracked in this report the ways in which that online rhetoric translated into real world harm, finding over 190 of our incidents that directly cited themes and tropes from this grooming conspiracy theory in some of the real world harm incidents that we were seeing.
Great, thank you. And Roman, of course, you've had a very personal experience with extremism in your country and in your own neighborhood. In 2022, for those who are not aware, Roman's club, Taplarin, was the victim of a firebomb, which was certainly a devastating event. I wonder, Roman, if you could just tell us a little bit more about that experience and some of the other impacts on the local community, and also some of the ways in which the community has tried to rally together in light of those incidents.
Okay, so it's almost 1 year ago, 12th of October, I was like sitting at home waiting for my partner when a friend of mine just called me asking if I'm okay, because there was a shooting at the Samotný street where is my bar, so I just switch off CCTV and I saw that there is somebody bleeding inside and there are the rescuers. So it was the very first touch with the tragedy, and it totally changed everything, in not just in my life, also in life of queer community, and it's still like a big wound for all the country, because somehow we were afraid of such an attack, but somehow it was unexpected, because the level of violence was so high. Something like, it was the very first terrorist attack in Slovakia, and the perpetrator, after the attack, he started to post at the Twitter some notes, like he's not regretting what he committed, and he posted manifesto. In the manifesto was written more about his inspiration. There were like a terrorist from New Zealand, USA, and it was all about white supremacy. And like that day, he's like the very first target was Slovak Prime Minister, but he was well protected. Then the other target was Jewish community, but he chose the queer people because we were not really well protected, just sitting in the bar, which is near the parliament, by the way. And so he just arrived, waited 40 minutes for maybe he was willing to kill more people, but that day there were only 3 people sitting there, so he shot 2 of them and injured the 3rd one. So, and the next day he committed a suicide. And yeah, but it was really painful for the community, because we really felt like alone in this situation, really afraid of next attacks, because the situation in Slovakia is really getting worse from 2013, and in every year we really see the hate speech towards LGBTI+ community is now like a normal thing. Also during the parliamentary debate, we have a member of parliament who said in the parliament that for queer people would be better if anybody will put stone on their feet and put them in the river. And he is still member of the parliament with no consequences. There is another politician which just 1 month ago said publicly in TV that we are plague for the country, and that LGBTI+ people are disaster for every country, and we are similar to corruption. So, and nothing is happening, no consequences. So.
And that's certainly a theme that we see in terms of the demonization and the lies that are told about our community. Densil, I wonder, just from position that you sit in, you talk to a lot of different people that have been experiencing this kind of extremism, and even if it's not violence, but also just conversation and intimidation. Tell us a little bit about what you're seeing.
Well, first, I just want to say thanks to everyone for making space for this important conversation and reflection. I think if nothing more, the queer community is a deeply intersectional community. We exist in all spaces, I think, and whether you are Jewish or Black or from Slovakia, wherever you are from, queer identities exist in these spaces. And I think what we don't realize is that often the spaces, the soil, the places we step into aren't prepared for being truly inclusive environments. And what we've seen, I think, in relation to I don't know if I want to call it a rise, but maybe a more blatant attack on our community, is that the soil has been softened for it to be okay. Right, we've seen an increase and more distributed rise in hate speech that is uniquely exported from America. That's an interesting thing for us to think about. Showing up in other countries and causing harm and havoc. I think what we've seen in our community is that it is not just one sort of subset population of queer identities that are being attacked or being harmed. Yes, you may have trans identities attacked and harmed at higher rates. But across our intersectional community, we are seeing attacks on young people, on youth, on our drag performers, and I think that's something that we need to be talking about. Is why is it that it's pervasive across the queer community, and why these attacks are continually happening? I think one of the things I've had the pleasure of being able to do is to speak to a lot of folks. And reflect on what's been happening. I think as we talk about the attacks internationally, I think about the Pulse nightclub shooting a couple of years ago. I think about what happened at Q in Denver, Colorado, only in 2022 as well. And sort of when you have the opportunity to hear from those who are perpetuating these crimes, these horrendous acts of violence, of terrorism, we find that they are being festered within these identities because of white supremacy, of a lack of feeling often that these people who are perpetuating these crimes are included in some spaces. So to me, it just goes back to this notion of how are we creating space and community for everyone to feel included so that when they do step into these spaces, they're not looking for reasons to sort of come back and attack people for not welcoming them into these spaces and places.
And I think some of the work that you've done also just sitting in Ohio has been focused on things that are happening at the legislative level as well. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think earlier this summer I saw that there were over 1,000 bills sort of passing through legislation focusing or having something to do with LGBTQ identities. Over half of those bills were anti-LGBTQ legislation, right? So those were bills that were saying your identity is not seen, you are not respected, you do not belong, right? So anti-LGBTQ legislation. And I think that's disturbing, immeasurably so. And we think back to how maybe some of these bills start to populate in places like Florida and Georgia, but we're seeing them be pervasive across our country. And what we realize is that I think some people like to call it a coordinated attack. I call it opportunistic, in that they see that it gains some traction in one location, and so someone else says, let's give that a shot. And I think that's the same thing when we're thinking about these terrorist attacks, these violent things that are happening in our community, is that people are saying, well, that seemed to work there, let's give that a shot. I think when our political structures are perpetuating and saying that these things are okay to put forward, then people are going to lean into it. People are going to believe that if our politicians are having discourses about who is accepted and who is not accepted, then this is something that we can have common discourse about in our non-political spaces. That's not okay. In the state of Ohio, we are seeing the same thing. We have over, I think, right about 7 or 8 anti-LGBTQ proposed legislation in the state right now. Frustrating.
Yes.
Ridiculous. And we're right next door to Pennsylvania, if you want to know that, right? So we're right next door. So these things are happening across our country. And again, people are seeing the soil being softened for this sort of violence and hate speech and these anti-LGBTQ legislation. But we're not seeing sort of, I would like to say, the same uptick of support for community that we should be seeing in these spaces to make, again, queer identities and LGBTQ folks understand that they are welcomed in these spaces.
Right. And on that note, we've also heard from a number of the speakers already today about the crossover and the overlap. And Sarah, I know that's something that comes out of your initiative between the ADL and GLAAD. I wonder if you could just tell the audience a little bit about the origin of that and how we're seeing that sort of concerted effort being put together?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm in kind of a unique position within ADL's Center on Extremism because I actually am considered an embedded analyst. This refers to a program started by our partnerships team in which we reach out to community partners like GLAAD, and jointly between ADL and the partner are creating analysts that get to sit side by side with the analysts within the Center on Extremism and work together to serve a variety of communities while also understanding that we are all facing the same perpetrators, the same extremist groups and movements that are targeting not only the Jewish community, not only the Black community, not only the immigrant community, but also the LGBTQ plus community in my case. And so it's been really a unique opportunity to be able to serve the queer community in this aspect while also working aside the ADL, which has such an amazing history working within the Jewish community. And to that end, we've actually been able to track some of the overlap in these different forms of hates in our incident collection. In the report that we released in June, we tracked an overlap in anti-Semitic and racist incidents with our anti-LGBTQ plus incident tracking, and found that over a third of our anti-LGBTQ plus incidents were also anti-Semitic, and about 40 were also racist. And so we know that these groups are, not just trying to target and harm the queer community, but are actively going after these other groups as well, which is, I think, really stressing the need for kind of coalition building in this space so that we can counter all these different forms of hate in the same venue.
And both GLAAD and ADL have had a focus on projecting messages and images and rewarding the projection of images. Are there any examples that you could share with us of how this coalition has been trying to support the presentation of positive images?
Sure. So at GLAAD is focused on kind of media advocacy. So a lot of their work centers on Hollywood and journalism and focusing on accurate representation of queer and trans identities. So you might have seen GLAAD's recent campaign focusing on the New York Times, which is calling for better coverage on trans issues, especially issues surrounding gender-affirming care. On ADL's side, we have an amazing educational team that focuses on our No Place for Hate curricula that builds out anti-bias training in schools all across the nation in order to kind of preempt some of these cases of radicalization that we're seeing starting from these younger and younger ages. So making sure that we are not only focusing kind of on the reactive side when we're seeing these examples of hate and extremism, but also focusing on portraying and building these positive and accepting ideals of the Jewish and queer communities.
Great, thank you. And Roman, I know that you've been very focused on specific political developments, and some of the allyship that you've been working on have been with the current president, who will not be running for office again. But I wonder if the tech team could put up a picture that Roman has shared with us, and maybe Roman, you could tell us a little bit about your experience in working with these elected officials.
Yes, so the days after the attack, the situation was for us really terrible because many politicians, or most of them, were pretending that it wasn't something serious, and they were not really doing some action to really prevent. So somehow our only hope was the president. And you saw the picture. It's a day after the attack. She arrived to my bar, and she did just one amazing thing. She just started to hug me, and I think the picture became kind of like a famous, and it was kind of symbol that the state is somehow still there for us, and there are at least some person representing the state which are taking care of us. So, and she's still a really big supporter of the queer community, but she's also under the attack of many conspiracy theory and extremists. So, and that was the reason why she decided not to go to the next election as a president and to quit the job after 5 years. And but what we did as a prevention, we really create like a big initiative called Our Lives Are at Stake. And somehow it was really important because we saw there are like many different communities and bubbles which wanted to help us. But we needed to create the coalition, something really huge with a really great impact. And I'm really grateful for the cooperation with the big companies, which were really supportive and help us activists to create something really like a professional with big impact. And I have to say that it was the biggest wave of solidarity towards LGBTI+ people in Slovakia, but it wasn't still enough big to really change the situation, as the enemy is much more bigger than we. And we are really facing the Russian propaganda, which is super successful in Slovakia. And there are many disinformation pages, and the public space is really poisoned by all these lies, conspiracy, and somehow we are losing hope, and we are really trying how we can change the situation. And on Saturday, there is going to be election in Slovakia, and many people are really afraid. Now we are facing the situation we can lose the democracy. And so there are many questions. There is still a bit hope, but let's see on Saturday.
Right, right. You know, this issue of intimidation and those who dare to be our allies, and I use the word our, quite broadly, is, perhaps one of the most disturbing trends. Densil, I know that you've spoken a lot about what allyship means and other kinds of solidarity means in this time. I wonder if you could share some of your thoughts about that.
And I would love to, if I can speak to the coalition part just for a little bit. I think it's, friends are great to have and always lovely to keep around. And I think when we think about coalition building, in particular in this space, we realize, again, that queer identities, LGBTQ identities exist in a lot of places, but it has been sort of a three-prong approach of talking about and uplifting these issues within the community. You mentioned GLAAD, which sort of the media focus, and then I think about how GLAAD and the Victory Institute, Victory Fund have worked together to prepare LGBTQ candidates to run for office and to encourage that. And then I think about how HRC leans into the space of, one, then raising funds for those candidates, but also ensuring that we're uplifting appropriate messaging and arming our elected officials with information about issues within our community. So I think when we think about coalition building, sometimes it's thinking about how partners who do really different things come together, even publicly or behind the scenes, to empower people to really take action within our community, which I think is a great thing. And so thankful for places like even Planned Parenthood and working with Planned Parenthood and Southern Poverty Law Center. Like, all of these organizations have tethers within queer issues because we exist in all these spaces, and so it's really great to see coalition come together in those moments. I think as we think about sort of anti-rhetoric and people speaking and sort of showing up in these spaces, I think one of the things that I spend a lot of time leaning into is ensuring that we are being able to inform people, changing hearts and minds. It's a conversation that HRC used to talk about a lot, right? Being able to tell stories, personal, intimate stories, to connect people to community who they may have not realized or didn't know that they were queer or gay or LGBTQ. A lot of folks often say, I don't know someone who is or someone who, but again, being able to say, these people, we exist within your spaces, allows someone to think differently about how they connect and communicate with folks in their community and what they're doing for them. I think my privilege, again, leans into the opportunity of being able to travel the country and see and hear from people about their different experiences that they're dealing with. I have the pleasure of serving as the CEO of the Pride Fund, which is a venture capital vehicle focused on investing in LGBTQ entrepreneurs. And one of the things we talk about in that space is this notion of allyship, and that investors can sometimes change communities through allyship, through their dollars. And often the next level of, I think, allyship to me is, showing up and being there and being supportive. But I think we're in this moment in our community that we've got to go a little bit beyond allyship, maybe, and talk about being an accomplice. And not saying that allies are not loved. We still love our allies. They are there. But I think maybe leveling up, as Beyonce or others might say, to this new level of what an ally is, an accomplice, someone who's there on the front lines with you, who's willing to, for lack of a better term, get bloody with you, right? Someone who says, I may not be part of their community, but I can hurt with your community. I am harmed when your community is harmed. There's a new level of accompliceness that's needed, right? When our political elected officials are out there speaking about LGBTQ issues, they don't need to necessarily only talk about the numbers and the statistics. That's great and wonderful, but we need them to also express the pain that we felt. That is the new level of an accomplice, is to say, here is the pain that the community is feeling. Here's a story. Here's a moment. Here's someone who I know that has dealt with this. Or here's how I personally have stepped in a room where there were no queer people, and I asked the question, what are we doing for the queer community in this particular moment? So I think, being able to level up to this new space of accomplice is important. It's what we would need right now. We're seeing that on the other side, right? When people are being more open about their hate in very public and in no uncertain terms. So we need our accomplices, love our allies, but we need our allies to level up to accomplice, to be just as poignant, just as focused, just as loud about their support for the queer community and what they're going to do.
Because I think we're coming up on, in the U.S., National Coming Out Day, which is October 11, and I think for a number of us who track the progress of this movement over time, there is also a very surprising and jarring element to it, because I think that is the kind of thing that might have been viewed as sort of obsolete, not really needed, and I think we're sensing that whether it be personal stories or just personal identification, to your point, that you do know someone who is queer, and so that unfortunately needs to be named in order for our allies and accomplices to step up. I wonder if the tech team could get ready with a video. We were delighted to have the participation in this program of a very unique individual, U.S. Special Envoy Jessica Stern. Her position is to advocate the human rights of LGBTQI persons. She was appointed by President Obama, and prior to taking on that role, she also has had a number of distinguished posts, including being the executive director of Outright International. This was a position that was specially founded by President Obama. It lay vacant for 4 years, and she has been doing fantastic work. And her remarks will provide a little bit of a perspective of what the current administration is trying to promote in terms of the foreign policy perspective on LGBTQI rights. So if we could have that video, please, I'd appreciate it.
Good morning. My name is Jessica Stern, and I'm the U.S. Special Envoy to advance the human rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex persons. I want to thank you all for being here today, and I'm sorry that I was not able to be there in person. I did, however, take the opportunity to send my Chief of Staff, Sarah Scarcelli-Roden, and I hope that you will have the opportunity to connect with her after the session or in the coming days. Let me begin by telling you a little bit about the work that my office does. As the U.S. Special Envoy to advance the human rights of LGBTQI+ persons, I lead U.S. foreign policy related to this population and the vulnerabilities it experiences, the violence and discrimination they endure. I have a mandate to enhance the impact of LGBTQI+ human rights defenders and civil society organizations globally, to equip U.S. embassies to respond to abuses against LGBTQI+ persons, and to embolden LGBTQI+ persons and their allies to envision a future where government and other stakeholders are supporters rather than opponents. Let me give you a few examples of this work in practice. Perhaps you've heard of so-called conversion therapy, but conversion therapy is a pervasive and underreported human rights abuse perpetrated against LGBTQI+ persons. Ranging from talk therapy to so-called corrective rape, conversion therapy remains unreported because of the shame that victims feel, and because the perpetrators may be family members, religious actors, or others in positions that should generate trust, not fear. My office led the effort to develop a U.S. government-wide action plan to combat so-called conversion therapy practices globally. If you haven't seen it, please find it online. The plan was finalized in May, and since then, we've overseen the implementation of the action plan's foreign policy and foreign assistance objectives. In addition to our work on conversion therapy, to help strengthen the work of civil society, the Department of State helps promote LGBTQI+ human rights through the Global Equality Fund. Thanks to the US and 26 partners, the Global Equality Fund supports civil society organizations committed to protecting the human rights of LGBTQI+ persons in every country. This partnership has provided more than $115 million across more than 100 countries since its inception in 2011. And to give you another example, at the multilateral level, the US led on the first ever consensus reference to sexual orientation and gender identity in a UN General Assembly resolution on elections. This happened in 2021, and it was a critical milestone for advancing the human rights of LGBTQI+ persons at the United Nations. The US will be facilitating this resolution again this year, and we're also hoping for success. As I begin my third year in this role, I'm looking back and I can see concrete successes, but I also see the challenges along the way. The truth is that LGBTQI+ persons are under attack around the world through old and new anti-LGBTQI+ laws and policies, hate speech, blackmail and extortion, and violence. They are scapegoated by politicians who, rather than address the core issues that their electorate put them in office to deal with, prefer to fan the flames of bigotry. They invent boogeymen like LGBTQI+ persons, journalists, racial and ethnic and religious minorities, immigrants, women, people living with disabilities, and other marginalized populations, to distract from their inability or unwillingness to offer real change. Most recently, we've seen this play out in Uganda with its passage of the Anti-Homosexuality Act. That law broadens criminal statutes and deepens penalties for consensual same-sex conduct and behavior. It includes a duty to report clause that would force doctors, landlords, and even family members to report anyone they have reason to suspect is a homosexual. Provisions like these around the world are intentionally vague because the goal is not to keep people safe. The goal is to distract from serious issues like corruption and poverty that don't have easy solutions. Hateful characterizations of LGBTQI+ persons have consequences. Framing an entire group of people as a threat to society is not just a dangerous way to manipulate your domestic populace. In a world connected through social media, hateful narratives spread with unprecedented speed and reach. In 2022, ILGA Europe reported that Europe and Central Asia had seen the deadliest rise in attacks in a decade, with incidents of attacks on LGBTQI+ persons reported in 54 different countries of Europe and Eurasia. We're also seeing how advancing the human rights of LGBTQI+ persons has become synonymous with so-called neocolonialism, or with the purported importation of Western ideals. That is false. LGBTQI+ persons live in every country and are fighting for their rights everywhere, across the global south and north. By reducing that advocacy to a symbol, the rainbow flag, it makes it easier for detractors to treat it more like a meme than a movement. In short, there is no ideological purity when it comes to hate. Extremists will target any marginalized group if it is convenient to their cause. And because hatred doesn't operate in silos, we can't afford to either. We need to reject the premise that advocacy is a zero-sum game, that we have to compete for airtime or donor dollars. Defending the human rights of LGBTQI+ persons does not diminish the fight for other marginalized groups. We are all strengthened when we speak the same simple, unequivocal truth. Hate is wrong. No matter the target, no matter the alleged justification, hate is wrong. If we all keep saying that in our own ways, in our own interactions with our families, friends, and neighbors, in our conference rooms and virtual meetings, in our online world and our offline spaces, whether face-to-face or in a large plenary session like this one, we can collectively amplify the message that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. As I draw to a conclusion, if you're looking for more specific recommendations for what you can do to protect the human rights of LGBTQI+ persons and be a more effective ally, I'd guide you to 3 core principles. 1, nothing about us without us. 2, do no harm. 3, do something. What do these mean? It means that if you haven't yet reached out to local LGBTQI organizations, please do so. They're best poised to tell you where there are threats and where there are opportunities for positive change. If you're from a philanthropic organization, I'd encourage you to add or increase your funding to LGBTQI+ civil society among your recipients of donor dollars. The nascent nature of this work means that investments in building organizational capacity can have an outsized impact. But whatever you do and however you work, be sure to do something. Describing anti-LGBTQI+ sentiment as the canary in the coal mine may sound cliche, but it's a cliche based on truth. If you want to eradicate hate, you must include a defense of the rights of LGBTQI+ persons wherever they're challenged. I wish you a fruitful dialogue over the coming days, and thank you for your solidarity and engagement with LGBTQI+ rights. Thank you.
Okay, and just with that, and we have about a couple of minutes left, I wonder if I could just go across the panel and for any final thoughts on things that you think you'd like the audience to take away from our discussion. Roman, I'll start with you at the end.
I think like the one important thing to really, that must be changed are the source of the information, especially the disinformation, and we really have to find the way how to fight it, and because that's the poisoned well, and the society is drinking from this disinformation, all these lies, and then the society became totally sick. And it's really difficult to heal.
Sarah?
Sure. So one thing I just want to make sure that we highlight in this discussion is making sure that we're centering trans voices and making sure that we are very much aware that the majority of these anti-LGBTQ+ attacks are specifically anti-trans in nature, and that we're actually seeing some of these groups trying to cause rifts within the LGBTQ+ rights movement themselves by driving this wedge of transphobia between trans persons and those who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or another member of the queer community. So I really just want to make sure that we are centering kind of that focus on anti-trans hate and understanding that trans rights are essential to queer liberation and to the LGBTQ+ movement as a whole.
Densil.
I live in this joyful world, so I'm going to leave a joy message. I think I reflect on, for everyone, we should remember what it's like to be a kid. That desire to want to be included, to be a part of a group, to feel welcomed in a space. I think as we leave this place, I think hopefully we can all take with us that notion and that ability to create spaces that are inclusive for different types of people. We all want to belong somewhere. We all want to feel included. And I think when we feel included and feel safe in spaces, so many beautiful things can happen. So that's it.
Thank you. And I think my closing thought would just be that there really is no action too small that can be taken to sort of advocate for these issues. And I think those of us who sit in this room certainly are among those who pay attention. But we need to stay vigilant, and whether it's just an encouraging word to an election worker or an encouraging word to the local librarian, who's being asked to take texts out of the classroom or off the library shelves, whatever step can be taken to try and make sure that we continue to be seen and feel supported will be an important step forward. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and thank you, panelists, very much.
Flag over here.